to order at 6:30 p.m. Can I get an approval of the agenda?
I'd like to make a motion to amend the agenda.
Okay.
We need to vote on the amendment and then amend the agenda. So, motion to amend the agenda.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion carries.
I move to strike the executive session portion of tonight's meeting from the agenda as there's no matters to cover in executive session.
Okay. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion carries.
Move to approve the amended agenda.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay,
Good job.
good job.
Nice.
All right, study items 2.01, COVID-19 mitigation measures.
Good evening, Board. Similar to previous presentations, House Bill 271 requires us to have the Board to approve our mitigation measures. We have identified the dates that will keep us in line with the 30 days. This is one of the work sessions where we have to present the information. Out of transparency, our goal is still the same. I do want to highlight a couple pieces. From our call today on the COVID-19 task force, they are finding that there is a downward trend to the data and that now the cases that are emerging are in adults rather than kids, which it was before. So our current transmission rate is 0.92% with a positivity rate of 7.60. That is a data posted, I believe, on 10/1. We are finding that for the zip code 63143 that we are having an increase in the number of cases in the past 14 days, but there has been no change for 63117. We are starting to see some things simmer down at the Early Childhood Center. Of course, as we shared before, that's one of our opportunities where we're paying close attention. We have no staff members in quarantine, no positive cases. We currently have 2 positive cases for students. We have 4 students in quarantine and 14 in modified quarantine. So the current mitigation measures, they have not changed with the addition of us adding the vaccination and/or weekly testing requirement as approved by the board previously. So it was in our best interest to include that as we asked for the board to approve our mitigation measures. And the administration actions are listed there for your review. Are there any questions about the mitigation measures or the data?
Has there been any discussion, Anita, about, we've had dips in the past several months ago and then like a resurgence, and there was I've heard some chatter that this could be the ebb and flow of how the virus actually operates in society. Is that something that's on the minds of?
It is. That was actually part of the conversation with the epidemiologists today. They were saying that we will continue to see the ebbs and flow, particularly with the winter months coming about and how we are to navigate those pieces. There is also conversation regarding test to stay. The state is exploring the option for schools if interested to do that. Some of the barriers for that include the personnel piece, not having enough people to actually facilitate the testing, and then also the operational side of it, who collects the tests and how they would actually be processed. So that is an ongoing piece. We will continue to have conversation about tests to stay on Thursdays. Information will be provided to the board and the board notes as I receive it.
Thanks.
How are the numbers looking for the student vaccination clinic?
So last we had 8 students signed up, and we're continuing to push that information out. I did reach out to some of our MRH influencers to ask them to post the flyer that was created by Vince as a means to encourage families to have their students to be vaccinated, and continuing to say that it's a both and. So we can have our staff members to be vaccinated, but we also need to ensure that our students are being vaccinated too. We did have some conversation regarding the students between the ages of 5 and 11, and having conversation regarding how those vaccinations will be administered. Currently, they're saying that Walgreens and CVS will not be administering the vaccines, so they're looking at who will partner and looking at changing some of the adult vaccination centers into pediatric centers so that students can actually come in. So that is also a conversation because the goal is to have as many students vaccinated as possible. Still working on the plan for that.
What's your impression for why those numbers remain low?
So I would probably guess, if I had a hunch, that we have more students vaccinated than cards actually submitted. And I have not, in the board note tomorrow, I'll give an update. Vince normally provides me the information every week to see where we are. We were last at 49%, which is a huge increase from what we previously reported, and we did raffle off some incentives as a means to encourage students to share that information, and also encouraging parents what the benefits are as it relates to contact tracing and modified quarantine, which is a huge piece of that as well.
That's what I was going to ask you about is if you don't have a student's card, then they're exposed, they have to go into quarantine versus modified quarantine. Is that correct?
They will, depending on several factors. It has to do with the airspace that they're in, also whether or not they were following the other mitigation measures, but it does actually make a difference, and it does for sports too. And so Misha, if students are actually vaccinated, the benefit for them is that they can actually continue with sports, but if a student is exposed, they have to go through, and actually it's like a 2-week period, and then for students who test positive for COVID, they actually have to stay out for 3 weeks because they have to be approved by their physician to return after the initial 2 weeks.
Excuse me, I don't know if you had any conversation with any parents that if this vaccine for the age group of 5 to 11 is approved soon, does there seem to be any willingness or hesitation possibly having a child receive this vaccine?
So I have spoken to a few parents who are interested in actually having their children vaccinated. Not a lot of parents reaching out, but they have been very supportive. Our community has been very supportive around our mitigation measures that are currently in place.
Yeah, I would think particularly with flu season coming, it seems like our younger children are the ones affected by that in most cases, although I know anyone can contract the flu, but generally smaller children at ACC, and it seems to spread very rapidly if someone really does have it. So I'm just concerned with parents who are waiting for this vaccine are willing to allow their children.
I would say from my initial conversations, yes. I do have a few parent engagement sessions scheduled, and that could be a question that I can pose as a means to ascertain if they're interested or what barriers they see in regards to having their kids vaccinated.
Is this perhaps an opportunity for us to do a parent education session, perhaps with Dr. Newland, about use of vaccine for those 12 and under or 12 and above as well?
I think that's a great idea. He actually participates on the calls every Thursday and is very open to coming out and doing sessions, particularly during Zoom. So I think that's an ask that we can make as a means to give parents an opportunity to pose questions.
It's a great idea. Any other questions?
Just one more comment. I've had some requests come to me for us to consider including the student vaccination rate as part of our COVID dashboard. I wonder what the parameters might be around offering something like that.
So we talked about that in COA on Monday, and we were waiting until we actually closed the window for staff to actually submit their vaccination cards, and then after we finish our clinic. So we were thinking early November to add that information to the dashboard. So it's coming, but we want to make sure that the information that we're putting out for families is as accurate as possible.
Thank you. Moving on to 2.02, using data to improve schools, data-driven decision making. Dr. Jameson.
Right, switch over. So I'm really excited about this session because it gives us an opportunity to take a deeper dive into data, particularly regarding some of the questions around cohort data and what students and how they're performing over time. But I do want to keep at the forefront that this is only one data source that we're looking at, and that's the conversation that's happening with building leaders. It's not just math data, we also are looking at STAR data, Fontes and Pinnell data, and other data that's being collected as a means to paint a better picture of the needs of our students. So here are our outcomes for today. I think it's important for me, particularly as a new superintendent, for us to understand the role of the board as it relates to data, and then also what the role of the superintendent is, in addition to the role of the cabinet to support the work that we're actually getting done, and then to understand how we analyze data to target student achievement gaps, and then looking at that data specifically around our students with IEPs, free and reduced lunch, and our McKinney-Vento students. To get us started, I do have an activity for you so I can build a bridge for where we're going next. So there should be some Post-it notes. On your table, perfect. And I am going to reveal a slide to you, and you will have 10 seconds to replicate that slide. You can't write anything, you get to look at it for 10 seconds.
And then we write after.
And then you write after. All right.
Put your phones down.
There you go.
Oh, man. A long day.
I'd like an IEP. I am not a visual learner.
I am. What does that say? 'Cause I still don't remember anything that was up there. I'm done.
I promise it's not a trick question. All right. So how many did you get?
4.
1. And the triangle.
So how challenging was it to
Define get. Maybe not in order, but I got some letters that were up there.
So many spaces. How many blanks we had to fill?
Well, I hate to say it, I went to an ophthalmologist today, and it just reminded me of an eye chart I had to look at. So,
I didn't pass at the eye doctor either.
yeah, well,
So was it challenging to replicate that?
Yes.
Yes.
So we have to do a little movement, and so we can have pairs of 2, a group of theory, and President Miller, do you mind joining?
I will go wherever you go.
All right, you can go down and,
Do I take the?
yes,
Okay.
take your pen. So now we're going to go through this activity again, and this time you get to strategize with your partner what your plan will be. So I'll give you 2 minutes to strategize the plan. And then we'll go through it again. Your plan for completing this task again.
Oh.
That's an interesting strategy. Okay, sure. Yeah.
Oh.
Let me do the top. Okay, I'll try. I'll do. I'll do the top, like the 1, 2, 3. And then I'll do the. Okay.
I mean, it would be nice if not. but-
Okay. And then we'll just try to figure it out.
Right, You have 1 more minute.
Because there's a pattern. I need
Yeah.
The pneumonic device.
Or you can let him toadstools. Happy infants fail. Peter, vacation.
I'm gonna
Wow.
forget who won the vacation. Was it the zebra? Was it the
Pneumonic devices, yeah.
This is like when I'm going for birthday or something.
Yeah.
Parking app.
I know, I can never remember.
That's time, you ready?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Here are your letters.
Oh.
Cheat.
It's
right.
a rhyme and reason to it. And that's time.
Oh.
You guys are working together to get them down.
I don't think I got a darn one.
I don't think I. It's numbers.
I think I need more discussion.
Yeah, I don't know.
They don't need any special
You like
But I got my
Yes.
So I would like my
We'll
Benito
see if it's
icebreakers.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, you were close.
So how'd you do? Full?
Worse.
All right, so we got 1, 2, I'm not going in order, I'm just saying what's up there.
They have to be in the right order.
They do have to be in the
Oh,
right
let me- all right, you got
Three letters in the right place.
We did better, yeah.
four.
So that's one of the questions. So what happened when you had an opportunity to plan and collaborate as a team?
Develop a strategy.
So strategies.
Strategies.
We could dissect the overall thing into different portions if you would take.
Less overwhelming.
Let's
I was gonna say that, less overwhelming.
Divide and conquer.
Okay. What did you notice about the experience when you did actually start to engage in the activity? Who was doing the talking? What did that look like?
I think we both were doing talking and trying to decide who would do what portion.
We were, but I would also say that I take over a little bit as a talker. And I could see how in a collaborative effort, someone might dominate. Right. See?
So the reason why I picked this particular activity, because this is just letters, but when we begin to think about how we dissect and analyze data, it is not an easy approach and it's not an easy task. And so the strategies that teams take to actually begin to dissect data, the conversations that are had, the thought that goes into it, and then whose voices are at the table and whose aren't is critical. Which kind of leads into the article for the pre-work. And I selected this particular article by Nancy Love, Building a High-Performing Data Culture, because as we talk about improvement as a district, that has to underpin the work. And so while this particular article is talking about teacher teams interacting with data, school boards, our COA team, even other teams within buildings are interacting with data as well. And so what I would like to do is go through and have each board member to kind of share out their significant ideas, the concepts that stood out, and 1 or 2 questions that you had. So we'll start with the 3 significant ideas. There's no particular order, and then we will kind of debrief using this protocol to say what are the connections and how does this relate to my work as superintendent and then your work as the board. So we'll start off with the 3 significant ideas that you took away from your section. And if you can say the page number for other board members too as we go through, that would be helpful.
Sure. I had the section that started on page 7 on collaborative inquiry. No, that's not true. Yes, sorry, it started on page, yes, okay. I'm like on page 9, right, okay. Leadership and capacity. I read a couple of pages. So, I think some significant ideas, this idea that every teacher is a change agent, I think really resonated with the persona of the MRH district as like a district of innovation, and that, you know, that was something that I think we try to do. The sense that kind of in the world, data has been used broadly often to punish teachers. And when teachers are rewarded for data, it's often like superficial. So the shifting mindset to data being more of a tool for continuous improvement, I think that improvement for teachers, but also for students, for buildings, and for the entire district is really exciting. And then I think this idea that trust is an incredibly important foundation for doing this kind of data work too.
Other thoughts?
I can go. I had section page 2 to top of page 7, I think, the very beginning of the article, I guess. So I was struck by the robust set of questions that the author poses as a way to, the lens in which to look at performance and data, and I thought that aligned really well with our focus on equity. The questions that were posed are very much who's doing well, who's not, and why, and how can we focus on those? How can we amplify our successes and also identify and be realistic about where we're falling back. So I thought that was, and how you define your success, the success of all kids really is important to it. And I thought those questions, one of the points that was made early on was also kind of piggybacks a little bit on what Katie said, seeks to empower teachers to seek solutions and answers. So it's not sort of a top-down approach. The teachers have autonomy and some empowerment to really share in the solution process, not just be judged by the outcomes, which I thought was great. And the author certainly talks about how some of the application of this data rigor and standards has had some positive effects, particularly with some really challenging school environments that were having significant effects with lack of proficiency across the board in some under-resourced, probably privileged school districts. Which also led me to my question about it, which I'll hold until we get to that.
Other thoughts?
I'll go next. I'll keep just circling around the table. I have page 17 to 20, which also included a pretty lengthy example, but it starts with the summative assessment data. And it was really helpful on page 14 to have the data pyramid diagram as I was contemplating the ideas that came forth about the summative data. I think we've talked in the past about how this data really comes too late for us to be able to take action in the moment about what the outcomes and what it reveals to us. But it also struck me that this summative annual assessment data is the most public data that is presented to our community, to our state. It's how our school is judged externally and often internally, and it is the least revealing data point within the data pyramid for what's truly going on within the buildings and really what student achievement is in its very complex facets. And it was clear from the section that use of this data is most effective when it's disaggregated to the fullest extent. There were several ways of disaggregating that we already do, but there were some that piqued my interest, particularly item level data. When you're actually looking at how a cohort would respond to a particular set of questions or a question as a way to capture, okay, maybe we didn't do how we wanted to do in mathematics, but let's drill down in which concepts, right? That's something that we don't typically review at this very high level. I was also struck with how little we are able to account for the biases that are embedded in these state tests. That is not something that we have a mechanism to address.
Actually, I'll go next because I was leading, I had the pages prior to Amber. So, and I have a common theme in my three big ideas were around time. And so how, and I had the actual data pyramid within my readings, and how data takes time and it takes diligence, but time isn't always on our side. And that was demonstrated, and I think Amber articulated it quite well, how sometimes we are so far down the road before we're able to look at the summative data. It's really that formulative data that we need. And then within that data pyramid, the 2 to 4 times a year around the data around people, practices, perceptions, that is, people aren't standardized and they change not twice, 4 times a year, not once a month, not once a week, minute by minute, and that's actually even reflected within the reading, how that is. And do we have the bandwidth within a district this size and a staff this small to really do that and do that as well as we want to do and adapt it? So.
I can go next. I started on page 20. That's where I started. Instructional improvement. I'm just really struck by the collective responsibility in school culture. And I really felt like our district does that, but I also, this idea, the commitment to serve each and every child really resonated for me, and the hope to make sure that we're doing that. I also, for me, the needing multiple data sources, I think that is, I'm still learning quite a bit of where we get our data and what data we're looking at, but that idea that, you know, one set is not gonna, even 2 sets are not going to show us everything that's going on, nor is one reading of that data set gonna show us what's going on. I had, actually, we're not at the questions. I had more questions than thoughts. I really just was thinking, what's our district's approach? Like, where are we in this whole model? I thought this model was really cool. And yet I kept thinking, well, don't we do some of this? And what of this are we not doing? And what of this are we doing? I came back to what are our biases and how are we dealing with those? I was curious about how other schools have improved their performance and how. And then my big one was, we use a state test, but how does our state compare to other states? Like, who's to say that the state tests across states are equal? And so how does that reflect when you go nationally or internationally for making sure we have student achievement?
My side was on page 7 and 8. And on page 7 there's a few things that kind of stuck out to me, particularly under cooperative inquiry creates data culture. It says equally exciting schools implementing cooperative inquiry not only improves student achievement on state tests and other local measures, they change their school culture by increasing collaboration and reflection on practice among teachers. And I thought that was pretty interesting. It also talks about the using the data project external evaluator, and how many teachers have reported to significant shifts in school culture of using external factors to explain lack of student achievement. And a lot of this I thought was things that we have talked about here in our district, and I feel that we've been data driven ever since I can remember, and it does reflect on how we deal with each group of students, and particularly children of color, those who might be from different income levels, those with special needs or disabilities. And I feel that this is pretty important that we continue to gather this data, but also I think it will help teachers also to understand that maybe we need to take a different approach in teaching some of our students based on some of this data, and we can find a way for these students to achieve just as well as anyone else, no matter what circumstances they may be in. So I got quite a bit out of it, and I thought it was a pretty good article that I read. I didn't read all of it, but I did read. I really enjoyed it. It made you stop and think. And like I said, I think you mentioned about how we compare with other states on our achievement level. I kind of wonder, just even locally, with some of our neighboring districts, how we're achieving, and maybe there's some comparison there that we can maybe study, in different subject matters.
You're still on one of my slides.
Very minds think alike. So, but I would just, that just came to my mind when I was doing this about local districts, and particularly those that are similar in size to ours. Maybe they're doing something different that we haven't tried before. So that's my feedback on this.
Thank you. So I had pages 11 through 13. One of the things that jumped out to me was a statement on page 12 where it said to view achievement gaps as solvable problems, not inevitable consequences of students. I find that conversations around achievement gaps often, in my opinion, take the approach of it's inevitable versus a problem that can be solved. And so I really liked that part of it, just us saying we can solve it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it is a solvable problem. And then I felt like they gave a concept for how to do that. One being to collaborate, right? We talk about that, but what does that look like? Getting the teachers involved, getting the staff involved, but also it talked about involving the children. Which is so funny because we always talk about who's at the table, and we're talking about student achievement, but how often are the students involved in the conversation around student achievement? So I thought that was an obvious miss, right? That they brought to the table, and then also talking about how to teach to different types of students. And I think that sometimes, we have great teachers, obviously, but all teachers, I imagine, are overworked, right? And so how do you teach to the mass, let alone individuals? But it talks about that concept of different students learn differently and how to teach to those students. And so I thought that was a very important concept. And then it talks about just coming together on some type of frequent basis to do different parts of the work. Because, and to Maria's point, and to I believe Amber's point and Rachel, sometimes we get the data, and then next year we get the data, and then next year we get the data, right? So how do we stay on top of the data through time so that it's not something that's just lost, or that we're just revisiting? We're actually actively working through that data to interpret what it means and do something about it before it's old, because as we know, data gets stale, and so if you wait 6 months or a year to deal with it, it's not even valid anymore sometimes. So the question I had, if we're at questions.
Well, you were the last one, so if you
Okay.
want to answer questions.
The question I had was how? How do we begin to do this? It's a lot, it's so many great ideas, but can we do them all? To Maria's point, does our district have even the capability to do it all? What would that look like? Like, how do we start to take this data and implement, I guess, a system
for analyzing and applying the data in a way that helps our students and helps bridge those gaps.
Other questions?
I had almost the exact same question. I approach the reading, always initially when there's a diagram, like you're here and you want to get here, and here's the steps you need to take. I need to see that really clearly illustrated to understand, especially in a subject matter in an area that I don't have a depth of personal experience. So along that journey, it was very useful that it was lined out. These are the steps and these are examples. It was very clearly laid out. But my question was, what processes and supports already exist in our framework? And of the ones that don't exist, do we have capacity to add the others? Where to start and where to grow this, and how to develop resources and capacity. I'm really struck by the collaborative emphasis of teachers really taking ownership for that process. But what does that mean for them on a daily basis when they also have classrooms full of students to teach?
I wasn't, Amber, you and I kind of were sharing a brain in this. So recognizing that we do data, and we have different ways of looking at data, but then and we do a really good job with our data. But then what's the next step with it? Where are there efficiencies because we are a small district, but without commercializing it? Because I picked up that in my section when it talked about the commercialization opportunities in data. Professionally, I work in that space and know that commercialization of data makes it less authentic. It makes it more convenient. But to me, I think that would be a disservice to this district because of how we are so small and nimble, and how in your charts, one student can really affect those bar graphs. So how do we do it our way without over commercializing it? Because it's an industry, and everybody's looking for efficiencies, and we're small, and how do we do that ourselves, home grow it in a way that keeps us authentic to who we are?
That was my, so I normally look for examples of where has this been applied and what have been the results of that. And they gave us some, but they're inspiring on one hand, but they're also very hard to implement. They feel like broad strokes were applied in situations where you had 70%, free and reduced lunch, or an Indian reservation where, you have basically one sort of racial makeup of the entire school. And I think they're meant to be inspirational in that we can do this in lower resourced environments. But I think about, you went from 70% below proficient to like 30% in a couple of years. Well, we have that 30% problem, so how do you get surgical with that 30%? And how do you really take what is broad-based sort of modeling of use of data and really apply it in almost like Maria said, at an individual sort of child level? Because we do have a small enough district where 2 or 3 kids could really throw off a cohort's percentages or the results, and it's very, very hard to just look at raw numbers and go, we're failing here, we need to do something broad. I think it's more surgical, it's much more specific to what's going on in our district, and unfortunately there's just not a lot of examples that I've seen that tackle that. There are examples of, we went into this impoverished district and made 30% gains across the board proficiency, which is great. You still have 30 or 40% of your kids falling behind. How are you dealing with that? Because I think my guess is you go back 2 or 3 years later, you probably still have that percentage of kids failing, in those particular courses.
Other questions?
I have one really quick, just based on what Francis said, because I really like that concept of we have to get surgical with it and really get down in there. I also thought about, what if we're looking at it wrong? We're looking at it as a whole, right? So we're taking these numbers as, okay, this is where we're at proficiency-wise, and then free and reduced lunch is here, and then, different sectors. But what if we're looking at the individual sectors and then attacking the numbers? So instead of just saying, as a whole, we're looking at our free and reduced lunch sector, okay, what is that percentage within that group? And then not attacking the group, but you know what I'm saying, attacking that. to me, that might be possible. Now, I don't analyze data, so this is so far out of my realm, it might not even be a concept that makes sense, but that's just what I was thinking about. Like in the law, that's one of the things that we do. We get down into that case, and then we get down into the weeds of that case, and we address those issues within, you know, what we're doing, and then go back to the whole, if that makes any sense.
To pull it out of the practitioner and then from the board perspective, though, I think, you know, it is potentially one of those things where we think about creating new positions, creating new, you know, spending more money and resources, to be honest with you, on where we need the most help. And because my takeaways or things that are like resonating and rattling around is it takes time. Teachers aren't, I don't think, data walks by nature, and you know, I wonder in the training coming up, I don't think there's a whole hell of a lot of like collaborative data modeling that you're going to be doing, and you know, it's more about the classroom teaching and pedagogy and things of that nature. So I think, yes, there's things you can, it's a both and, but you have to then, as board members, I think, we have to stand behind the idea of we're increasing, you know, the biggest expense in the district by another 25% for probably some people that aren't certified classroom teachers, but are going to be helping with individualized cases in the data sets that are positions that probably most community members haven't heard of before. They're going to be new positions within, you know, a public school district that, you know, it's not a social worker, it's going to be something, and maybe it is, but it's hybrids.
Mm-hmm.
And so as boards, I think we should be thinking about what does that look like, so we don't have teachers working 70, 80-hour weeks trying
Absolutely.
to.
You guys are still in my slides.
Yeah. I mean, I'm again, I think we're all fairly aligned. I mean, one of my specific questions is what things are educators being encouraged to let go of in order to direct appropriate energy at this? I think we can't just keep adding.
Right.
And I think as we talk about, you know, scaffolding for students, and I think to Francis's point just now, there's got to be scaffolded adjustment for educators and adoption for educators too, right? We have, I'm sure, some rock stars in the district who are using, you know, data daily to make really great instructional decisions. And we have plenty of folks who got into education just because they like kids and they, you know, have a real interest in their subject area, but maybe aren't, you know, as surgical with the data. And I think all of those folks have to come along with us.
Other questions? So I thought this quote captured a lot of what was shared, that it's really not about crunching numbers. It's more about that collaboration and looking at what we currently have in place. And there are examples of exemplars in the district. Today, as part of my work as superintendent, I had an opportunity to observe a meeting taking place with teachers, and they were looking at samples of student work. They were having conversation around what concepts and skills that students needed, and they were having conversations around, so what is the exemplar, and then what will it take to actually get there? We have some buildings that are in different places than others. So today I was at the ECC, and Roxana and I were kind of debriefing, where do we need to put our support and our efforts? And so to the points that are being made, we do have some amazing teachers. They are committed, but it's reshaping how we think about data and being smart about the use of data so that it doesn't become an extra burden or something else to do. I think the other piece, thinking about what's organic, and so one of the things that we're talking about is not going into, this is what you need to do step by step, but having those conversations and having the educators to begin to think about what goals they want to establish for their kids and the amount of time it takes for them to get there, and then how will they respond instructionally when the kids don't get it. And I think that's the piece that we're working on now as we talk about tiered systems of support and interventions for those kids who continue to not perform well. So this is the slide, I'm just gonna show it, where I said, you're still in my thunder, Rachel. And I think Ralph also talked about this too. And so one of the things that we're hoping to do this year is to continue to bring more data to the board, so it's not just this is map data. So every time STAR benchmark, which is considered our local assessment, is given, we will continue to bring high-level data for the board to have conversation around and to ask those questions to Francis' point around how does the board need to support the decisions that we're making. And so trends, I think right now we recognize that the pandemic has had an impact, and we will see that when we look at the data. And then also looking at competition. So I didn't like that word, but that was the word that actually came from the National School Board Association, but they basically were saying with like-sized districts, which Ralph talked about, similar districts, how are they performing, and not necessarily looking at what they're doing, but thinking about the comparison not being to the state, but looking internally to say how do we improve practice for ourselves. And the other piece is looking at state targets, but for me, the one that resonated was disaggregating data so that we can drill down to those subgroups that are not performing. And so those are the conversations that I'm having when I'm meeting with principals. Those are the plans that they're creating with their teachers so that we can see some movement for students. So Francis, this is the one that I said you're still on my thunder. So I thought it was important to kind of look at this piece around data and accountability, because unfortunately they both are attached. The state says it's attached. You have the federal piece, but the aim is not to have data to be something that's punitive for teachers, and really to have it to be something that they embrace as they move forward. So a couple of things noted there. I'm not going to read them, but it really talks about the administration bringing data on a regular basis to the board, but also recommending resources to the board that may need to be approved, which is what Francis was talking about regarding staffing and even also changing policies. So as I backwalk that from the National School Board Association from Wake, this is how the two areas and roles line up. And so, you know, there is a lot of similarity. So I'm just gonna give you a second to look at that and just kind of ask what resonates, what's striking, what questions come to mind as you look at the role of the board and then also the role of the superintendent as it relates to data.
I actually appreciate that it's an actual board role. I think we've talked about not being in the weeds, wanting to support, but oftentimes I think trying to come up with things when you know what you need better than we do, and we just want to support you in what you need. And I think that really establishes that the board's job is to support the administration and making, like what Francis said, you know, if we have to add positions or add, you know, funding, what do we need to do? So I really appreciate that.
I would add though, we have to add the funding, but we have to have measurable outcomes for
Yep.
that funding.
Absolutely.
So it's not just support, it's also
Checks and balances.
where does that, how is that being tracked and how is that being measured? Because we are stewards of that public funding and we do
Absolutely.
link it, and I think this links it nicely. You know, I think this might be a little off topic, but you know, I'm always up for railing against the state. The moving goalposts that go on with the necessary assessments that really are tied to our funding. So I understand how both hands are pretty much tied behind your back on this. Is part of the data conversation also, especially for a district like ours, can we create some internal metrics for our students that match up with the state? Like that if there's discrepancies, we can say, but look, I understand what the state's measuring. Here's what we're doing with these assignments that we put in, and this is what how these kids are performing on what we think are meaningful progress points in their education.
I think you were eavesdropping on the conversation that Rachel and Roxanne and I
I just
were
like to
having
stick it back to the state.
the other day. So part of it, so yes, you're absolutely correct. It continues to change, and they are currently, the department are currently looking at competency-based approach, and then also allowing districts to use local assessments, not quite there yet. I love the idea of us being able to use the local assessments because they're more frequent. And I think I said before, map data is great, but it's old by the time you get it, and you have a group of students and you need some ready available data to be able to make some actionable changes. But they are currently having conversations. We talked about the data sources that they are suggesting. So for example, in the last superintendent's meeting, they talked about NWEA as one. So I don't know if the state is looking to require districts to pick the one that they select, or if we would be allowed to continue with STAR, but that is the direction that they're going for that. And then also using a lens of equity to determine what does growth look like, and how do we then look at other districts who may have a smaller population of students who are not performing in those subgroups, whether it's the McKinney-Vento students, free and reduced lunch, IEP, so that there's some increased accountability for them. And so I believe that M6 will open doors for some creativity to what you're sharing, because the conversations that we're having in buildings now is not germane to map data. It really is around STAR data and what they're seeing and the standards that students are missing and reteaching.
I think that has a really interesting opportunity to reframe the community dialogue as well.
Yeah.
As you said, remember about like the only thing they know about is these state assessed, end of course kind of things. And, if we can start showing there's other things going on and progress being made, that it isn't all as negative as it seems, and much more real time, I think that would be cool.
Yeah, and to what Rachel was asking before too, I think there is a flip side of that, like local side of things too, right? Is that we don't necessarily have a good way of comparing ourselves to other states or to, other things going on, because again, we've, as a state, rejected, the alignment of standards with other places. And so it is, I think there is that push-pull sometimes of, what do we know that kids are going to need to know to be successful in the world that we're going to be launching them into, versus what are the tested standards that happen to be on the Missouri test or, whatever assessment tool that we're using. And I think the district and the board has done a good job of trying to keep an eye on both of those things through our metaphors and other things, but I do think we've got to continue to push on that.
And then in my piece would be the communication. So in thinking like the data presentation we most recently had at a board meeting, some of the community might have been alarmed by some of the numbers or the percentages, but to back that up with context, right? We have 1,300, 1,500 kiddos in this district. That's what's in a class at a bigger school district that we are compared to, right? So how do we work collectively with everything that my colleagues just talked about to communicate this in messaging to our community, that it's more than map test scores. Our communities like to read in headlines, right? And map test scores get headlines in newspapers. How do we tell that story beyond those headlines?
So our last piece is just a way for us to begin to talk about data. And so the data that Rachel shared with us is high-level data. So it is cohort data, and I believe Kat put in your folders a paper copy for you to begin to look at. And so just kind of, you see the conversations, it's not anything that's scripted, it's very organic. I actually took our admin through this during the summer when we first engaged, and it really was a conversation, and so we made predictions around the data. So just kind of, sharing out what predictions might you have when I reveal or go visual with the data. What might you see based on what you already know?
Racial disparities in achievement.
So you predict racial disparity in achievement.
Gender disparity and income disparity.
So gender, income,
Of course, disparities with children with disabilities.
so you might see that. When you think about, and I think, again, looking at context, you will find that as we start with the 6th grade group of data when we show it, and as we get to the 9th grade, you'll see some very interesting trends. And so the next phase that we'll go into is going visual and making observations. So I'm going to actually leave this slide here and give you a few minutes to actually look through the data that's in your folder. And if you can just jot down some observations that you find from the data.
Should we go beyond this first slide?
Yes, you can go through the full data set.
Anita, will you do me a favor? I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. First grouping says 3rd at the bottom, and the
Yes.
second says 5th.
Yes, because it's cohort data, so from the testing, because we did, due to the pandemic, some kids didn't test.
Okay.
So this is 3rd, 5th, and then it's 6th grade math data.
Okay.
Sixth right now. And then what they did with them fit in there.
And also like what we have here. Just as a note, we'll come back with the drill down data for these same cohorts of students. And so the aim is to bring small chunks so that it's manageable. So that information will be forthcoming.
I like that.
We have one more minute to make observations. Also want to remind us that when we go through this part of the process, we do want to celebrate the successes, even though they may not appear to be there. So I'm going to model what that looks like. So for example, when we talked about 6th grade comm arts, we did decrease the number of students in below basic in a cohort. And the reason why I'm lifting that up is that that is one of the most difficult transitions for students from below basic to basic. And when we begin to think about the calculations for MPI, they actually give more points for students who move from below basic to basic. So just kind of modeling when these conversations are being had with teachers, it's not going in looking at it from a deficit mindset. It is what can we celebrate, but what other observations might we observe? And so I'll just open it up. Observations.
I think you can also kind of see that COVID has had an effect, obviously, because some of the numbers come down on advanced and proficient to basic. But I do think that that is, we don't want that, but that's to be expected. It's understandable in a pandemic.
Absolutely.
And I think for me, bringing in the outside factors, I wrote a bunch of them down. One being that, quite honestly, as you get older, the topics get harder. So there's going to be some level of, you could see potentially some level of decline because what you're studying has gotten harder. But I also found myself thinking about, there's that huge transition between 6th and 7th, but I also wonder,
You're jumping to the wanderings.
oh, I'm not supposed to be wondering, sorry, I'm just supposed to be
That's okay.
making observations,
Yeah.
okay. No, I got wonderings. I evidently don't observe.
That's
I only
okay,
wonder.
that's okay. Everybody doesn't have to share, just want to give space to if there are observations in the data that you want to lift out.
I was going to note, I was struck by how closely the averages correlate between the subjects. I would not have expected that, and those averages track very consistently.
Other observations?
Mathematics stands out as an area of concern with below basic and basic, and you kind of lump those together. There's some variability. It's not all negative, and there have been some gains. But when you look at the highest percentages of certainly below basic, they tend to show up in the mathematics across different grade levels.
And that would be germane across the state too. And so that has been part of the conversation regarding standards, what's happening instructionally, and support for students who fall in those various subgroups.
Well, do you think COVID played a big part in this, for this math?
I would say so, because when you think about the skills and concepts and the changes from a developmental level, from kindergarten to first to second, and I think Rachel said something about 6th grade, so you do begin to see a shift in the rigor and also the standards, so absolutely.
I'm also aware that there's also been quite a bit of change in the way we teach math, so we're not going to see that data for a couple of years moving forward. So any decline has already been started to be worked on. And so the data's not going to reflect that just yet.
It might. You're talking about the change to Common Core, it's Common Core now, right?
Well,
Common Core. I'm like,
Whatever.
it's a nightmare that I'm trying to forget, but because I think my girls were in one of the early classes that did it, and now they're at night, and so I'm assuming that the data is now, because I was like,
a Common Core, but even just the way we teach it within our district,
mhm.
there feels like, I got a 10th and an 8th. And their experience just within those 2 years has been very different.
Oh, okay.
And the way I see the 8th graders math and the middle schools bringing them up and the elementary school bringing them to the middle school to the high school, I don't think we're seeing that positive data yet. And so I want to be aware of that, but I've noticed the changes in the way we do things, but that's not going to be reflected here.
And I would say that teaching virtually, the ability to be able to actually deliver instruction in a manner that would actually fill those gaps was not an easy task for teachers too. So I do want to put that into the space. And then also think about how do we begin to accelerate learning versus focusing on the gaps. So I have questions. The last part of this is, what questions come to mind for you after you looked at the data, but going back to the idea of the role of the board. So what questions would you have for administration, or what wonderings would you have from the data set that was provided as a means to improve outcomes for kids?
Okay, I've got a wondering. This is more pie in the sky though. What about the change of kids who leave the district? So when we hit the high school and kids leave to go to different schools that are not in our district anymore, how does that affect the data? I don't want to assume that kids who are leaving are only the smart kids, but there might be something to be said for kids leaving for a more,
Something more challenging?
thank you, something. And so what does that do to the data that might not reflect well on us, but doesn't really mean there was a huge decline?
I would say historically some of our highest proficiency rates have been at the high school level.
So can I do the transverse of that and say, what is the impact of transfer students that have not had the benefit of the MRH experience on the data? And then as a board member, it's been around a little while. And then we have our new board members, maybe a timeline of how the map, because it's, sometimes we're comparing apples to oranges here just because of the test itself. And I don't know how to articulate how that would look, but just a narrative of how it's changed, the last 5-6 years or something like that. Not the actual test itself, but the concepts around how they've done it. Because it's also been from paper testing to, everything is online now as well. I think that our newer board members would appreciate that historical perspective.
Yeah, I think along those same lines, it would be nice to see some historical timelining of where we've made some intentional investments with the intention to impact issues. Because, again, I've been on the board for 8 years. We've been, talking about some of these same challenges. We've definitely tried some things. And, to the points that have been made, I don't think anybody expects that we will see, a giant jump from basic to advanced, because we added, a math interventionist at a grade level, but to, maybe start to see, are these things that we're starting to pan out? Do we need to change course? Do we need to, reallocate something? I mean, I think going back to my original thing, maybe it is just continuing to layer on different interventions, but maybe there are some things that we stopped doing because, they haven't panned out the way that we had hoped that they would.
In my world, we call that ROI. So.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, can't totally boil our kids and our teachers down to that, and
No,
yet
but-
we certainly are gonna try.
Yeah, we're into 8. It just, what's the outcomes of it?
Right. Yeah.
Outcomes weighed up against investment.
I'm curious about that. So Katie, what you're saying is an annotation to this that shows, after we got these results, we hired 3 math interventionists in the high school.
Yeah.
What would be some other annotations that we would make? What are some other ways that we have responded to the data in the past?
I like that idea.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, and I think there are probably some more like direct and then more indirect, you know, ways of acknowledging that too, right? Like
Natural.
clubs that got formed because, you know, to engage some students who were, you know, disengaged or something, you know, like that, you know, we didn't necessarily say like, oh, we've got to find a way to get those 5 kids better connected to whatever, right? But somebody did.
And an example might also be our students, our Success Center and our new visions. What's the journey of that? Because it really was rooted in data, and then how has that data informed us to make the changes that we're embarking on now?
Also, I want to mention, with the mathematics, is this problem where maybe more of our male students are having a challenge? Or is it the scores, or you know, I guess we have to look at gender to see more or less who's will benefit the most having more success with mathematics, or is it students of color, or any other group that we might need to consider? Because the math scores seem to always not be at a level which I feel that they should be. I feel like it's been a challenge for us, probably in maybe every district to some degree. And maybe we need to look at our approach of how math is being taught.
Which we have.
Yeah.
And are continuing.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's a good example of how challenging the problem is here with the size of the district, and not to be repetitive, but to go back to my other point, like, I mean, there's a lot of data, if you look at this raw disaggregated data, where you could, without the knowledge of us having been on board and knowing there are achievement gaps in specialized groups that we've seen and have seen for year after year after year, you know, you can look at this and start adding up basic, proficient, and advanced percentages in a lot of these categories and hit 70, 75% of the student body or more. And, you know, how do you get a sense of urgency for that 20, 15% that is below basic and struggling, or the people you want to move from basic to proficient? You know, those incremental movements, I think, are a lot harder when you have a category where you have 31% of the students who took it are in advanced. You know, there's community members that would feel like that's just kids that worked really hard and, you know, did great, and there's always going to be this spread. How do you systemically use data to actually make changes around that? And I think that's a very difficult communication, and even, I wonder, as a board member, how do you communicate it internally to a staff? There may be staff members who feel like, look, 60% of our population is proficient or advanced in my grade, in my subject. Like, I'm doing everything I can. How am I, you know, back to our whole point about other supports and hearing, you know, what else could they potentially use to reach out to those other students. But that, the example of disaggregated data could certainly lead you down that road of sort of saying, this is the opposite of what the examples in the article pointed to, right? Where they had 70% like below basic.
And that's the interesting piece. The article pulling it was the idea centered around collaboration and how that is what moves the needle and the conversations that are actually taking place in teams. And so it is actually rewarding and exciting to be able to walk into our buildings and observe that. And there are opportunities, but again, there are things that, to Francis' point, how do we become surgical about drilling down? And it's a simple conversation, and when staff get it, it's like, oh, that makes sense. But sometimes it takes being in the room and having that conversation and collective synergy around improving outcomes for kids. This is the connection here. Last slide to wrap us up for tonight. I thought this definitely defines how it all fits together and how it is a systems approach, and it is not something that we do in isolation. Continuous improvement is a system. That's how we improve results. That's how we improve teaching and learning, and that's how we improve outcomes for kids. And the support has to be equitable. That's all I got for tonight. Any other questions before we wrap up?
I do have one quick question. There's something that's been rolling around in my mind since we talked about this slide comparing ourselves to other districts. I think another important data point for us to capture would be compensation. I think that there's a connection to our efforts and our outcomes. And maybe I'm off base here, but I feel like that's a student achievement and teacher compensation have a relationship.
That's one of the roles of the board.
And we have a goal, or at least about that.
Well, I thank everyone for engaging in my activities and the conversation and the pre-work.
Thank you for the homework.
To make it meaningful and really think about how we think about data and how we can work collaboratively to improve outcomes for our students. We have staff who are committed, we have administrators who are committed. We just have to peel back the layers of the onion to determine where we need to focus our efforts, our resources.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to dig in with the caveat that, you know, this is y'all's expertise area. We, you know, should be additive, not distracting or, you know, creating extra mess to be waded through. So, you know, we'll try and be a well-functioning FAA. Yeah, and I mean, I think, again, to acknowledge that, like, there's a lot of good stuff going on in the district, and we honor that, and we appreciate that, and want to push for even that, you know, closing those gaps further.
Absolutely. So we actually have an action item right before we go, which is to vote on the COVID-19 mitigation measures.
You caught the action.
I move to reapprove the MRH universal mitigation measures.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay. Thank you, guys. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Meeting adjourned.
You're not willing to-